The morning sun of Paris filtered through the silk curtains of Emma Roberts' room, gently illuminating the luxurious space she called home. The 23-year-old opened her eyes slowly, feeling the familiar weight of dissatisfaction that had been accumulating in her chest for months. She got out of the king-size bed, her bare feet touching the cold marble floor, and walked to the window, gazing at the city she once loved but now felt suffocated by. Emma sighed deeply, running her fingers through her perfectly arranged blonde hair. Another day, another facade, she murmured to herself as she prepared to face the world that oppressed her so much. Born into one of France's wealthiest and most influential families, the Roberts, Emma was the heir to a wine empire that spanned generations. Since childhood, she had been groomed to take over the family business, educated in the best schools, and presented to Parisian high society as the crown jewel of the Roberts. As she dressed in an elegant designer dress, Emma reflected on the events of the previous night. Another extravagant party, more fake smiles, more idle talk about wine and business. She could clearly hear the flattering voices in her mind. "Emma, darling, you look stunning tonight. The Roberts sure know how to throw a party, don't they? I hear you're about to acquire another vineyard in Burgundy. Fascinating." Every word, every gesture, seemed calculated, measured, fake. Emma knew these people weren't interested in her, but rather the name she carried, the fortune she represented, the connections she could provide. Descending the marble staircase of the Robert mansion, Emma was greeted by Giselle, the housekeeper who had cared for her since childhood. "Good morning, Mademoiselle Emma. Breakfast is served on the terrace. Your parents have already left for a business meeting." Emma forced a smile. "Thank you, Giselle. As always, right?" The housekeeper hesitated for a moment, noticing the sadness in the young woman's eyes. "Is everything all right, mademoiselle?" "Yes, yes," Emma quickly replied. "Just tired." On the terrace, while absent-mindedly picking at a croissant, Emma flipped through the pages of a society magazine. Her face graced the cover, next to a young businessman she had been seen talking to at the last charity gala. The headline speculated about a possible romance. Emma tossed the magazine aside, feeling a wave of nausea. That man, like so many others, had only approached her out of interest. Throughout the conversation, he had only talked about business mergers and how a partnership between their families could be mutually beneficial. At that moment, looking at the city that stretched beyond the walls of the Robert estate, Emma felt something inside her break. The realization that she could no longer live like this hit her with the force of a tsunami. "I can't take it anymore," she whispered to herself, tears beginning to form in her eyes. That afternoon, locked in her room, Emma began planning her escape. She knew it would be difficult, maybe even impossible, but the idea of continuing to live that empty and superficial life was even more frightening. With trembling hands, she opened her laptop and began researching. Distant countries, small towns, places where no one would know the name Robert. She needed a fresh start, a chance to discover who she really was away from the expectations and judging eyes of Parisian high society. While planning, Emma heard a soft knock on the door. It was her mother, Celestine Robert. "Emma, dear, may I come in?" Quickly closing the laptop, Emma replied, "Of course, mother." Celestine entered, elegant as always in her Chanel suit. She looked at her daughter with a mix of concern and misunderstanding. "Emma, you disappeared from the party last night. Young Beaumont was asking about you. He's a great match, you know. His family has wonderful connections in the business world." Emma felt her stomach churn. "Mother, please. I'm not interested in Beaumont or any other great match." Celestine sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Darling, you need to understand. We have a position to maintain, expectations to meet. That's how our world works. And what if I no longer want to be part of this world?" Emma asked, her voice almost a whisper. Her mother looked at her as if she had said something completely absurd. "Don't be ridiculous, Emma. This is your world. It's who you are." At that moment, Emma knew her decision was made. She could no longer live like this, trapped in a golden cage, suffocated by expectations and falsehoods. That night, after everyone in the mansion had retired, Emma put her plan into action. With a small suitcase containing only the essentials and a modest amount of money, she left behind everything she knew. Standing at her bedroom door, looking one last time at the space that had been her refuge for so many years, Emma felt a mix of fear and excitement. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. "Goodbye, Emma Robert," she whispered to herself, closing the door softly behind her. "It's time to discover who I really am." And so, under the mantle of the Parisian night, Emma Robert disappeared, leaving behind a life of luxury and privilege in search of something money couldn't buy: authenticity and true connections. The bus shook slightly as it entered the small town of Nerja on the southern coast of Spain. Emma, now known as Sophie Lambert, opened her eyes, waking from a light, restless sleep. She looked out the window, observing the narrow streets and typical white houses of the region. A mix of anxiety and relief coursed through her body. She was far from Paris, far from her old life. "Last stop, Nerja," the driver announced in Spanish. Sophie grabbed her worn backpack, the only luggage she brought from her previous life, and got off the bus. The heat of southern Spain enveloped her immediately, so different from the mild climate of Paris. She took a deep breath, smelling the sea in something she couldn't identify. Freedom, perhaps. With a crumpled map in hand, Sophie walked the street searching for the address she had noted. After a few minutes of walking, she arrived at a small three-story building. On the third floor, a gray-haired, wrinkled-faced lady awaited her. "You must be Sophie," the lady said in Spanish with a strong Andalusian accent. "I'm Dolores, your landlady." Sophie nodded, trying to remember the Spanish she had hurriedly learned in recent weeks. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for having me, Mrs. Dolores." The apartment was tiny compared to the standards Emma was used to. A small room that also served as a bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and a simple bathroom. But for Sophie, it was perfect. "It's not much, but it's clean and has a lovely view of the sea," Dolores said, opening the faded curtains. Sophie smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. "It's wonderful." In the days that followed, Sophie threw herself into her new life. She woke up early, walked along the beach, and then went job hunting. It was during one of these walks that she found El Rincón del Sol, a small seaside restaurant. "Experience?" asked Javier, the restaurant owner, a middle-aged man with an impressive mustache. Sophie hesitated. "Not much," she admitted. "But I learn quickly and am willing to work hard." Javier observed her for a moment, scratching his chin. "Well, we need help for the summer season. You can start tomorrow as a waitress. We'll see how you do." The work was exhausting. Sophie, used to being served, now spent hours on her feet, balancing trays, taking orders, and dealing with demanding customers. Her hands, once soft and well manicured, now had calluses. But, surprisingly, she felt good. One night, after the shift, while cleaning the tables, Sophie heard Javier talking to his wife, Carmen. "The French girl is doing well," Javier said. "Works hard." Carmen nodded. "Yes, but there's something about her, it seems like she's running from something." Sophie froze, her heart racing. Could they have found out? "We all have a past, dear," Javier replied. "The important thing is she's a good employee." Sophie breathed a sigh of relief, continuing her work. That conversation made her realize how far she had come from her old life. In her tiny apartment, Sophie began to create a new routine. In the morning, she made coffee in an old coffee maker she bought at a thrift store. At night, she sat on the small balcony, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean. One day, while shopping at the local market, Sophie found herself smiling as she haggled over the price of tomatoes with a vendor. It was something she would never have done in her previous life. 3 for €2, miss. It's my final offer, said the vendor with a cheeky smile. Sophie laughed. All right, you win. At that moment, carrying her shopping bag through the cobbled streets, Sophie realized that, for the first time in a long time, she felt light. There were no expectations to meet, no image to maintain. It was just her, living a simple but authentic life. At night, lying in her simple bed, Sophie looked at the peeling ceiling and smiled. Paris, with all its glamour and luxury, seemed like a distant dream. Here, in this small Spanish town, she was finally beginning to find herself. Summer in Nerja was in full swing, and El Rincón del Sol buzzed with activity. Sophie, now an experienced waitress, skillfully navigated the tables, balancing plates and glasses with a grace she never imagined she possessed. It was on a particularly busy afternoon that she met Miguel. The young Spaniard with dark hair and an easy smile had been hired to help in the kitchen during the high season. "Hi, I'm Miguel," he introduced himself during a break, extending a flower-covered hand. "You must be the French girl everyone's talking about." Sophie laughed, shaking his hand. "That's me. Sophie. I hope they're talking good." Miguel smiled. "Only good things, I promise. They say you work as if your life depended on it. And doesn't it?" Sophie joked, but there was a hint of truth in her words. In the days that followed, Sophie and Miguel developed a friendship. During breaks, they talked about everything and nothing. Miguel told her about his family, his dreams of one day opening his own restaurant. Sophie, in turn, shared edited versions of her life, always careful not to reveal too much. One night, after work, Miguel invited her to join a group of friends on the beach. Sophie hesitated at first but eventually accepted. On the sand, under the stars, Sophie found herself surrounded by a lively group. There was Elena, a local teacher, Juan, a fisherman with a contagious smile, and Maria, a street artist with colorful hair. "So, Sophie," said Elena, handing her a bottle of cheap beer, "what brought you to our little Nerja?" Sophie felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the fear of being discovered. But looking at those smiling faces, so different from the social masks she knew in Paris, she decided to risk a version of the truth. I needed a fresh start," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Paris became suffocating. I didn't know who I was there. To her surprise, there was no judgment in her new friend's eyes. Only understanding and perhaps a little admiration. "Sometimes it takes courage to start over," said Juan, raising his bottle. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," everyone echoed, and Sophie felt a wave of emotion she couldn't name. The weeks turned into months, and Sophie found herself increasingly integrated into life in Nerja. Her mornings began with runs on the beach with Elena. The afternoons were filled with work at the restaurant, now punctuated by laughter and conversations with Miguel and the other staff. The nights, once lonely, now often ended in impromptu dinners at Sophie's tiny apartment, where her friends gathered, bringing homemade dishes and cheap wine. It was during one of these dinners that Sophie realized how much her life had changed. Sitting on the floor of her tiny apartment, laughing at a joke by Miguel while Maria played the guitar, she felt a pure and simple happiness she had never experienced in Paris. Of course, there were difficulties. The waitress's salary barely covered her expenses, and Sophie often found herself counting pennies at the end of the month. There were nights when she cried silently, missing the comfort of her old life. But then, Miguel would appear at her door with a plate of paella his mother had made, or Elena would drag her to a local flea market, and Sophie remembered why she chose this life. One afternoon, as they walked along the beach after work, Miguel asked, "Sophie, are you happy here?" She stopped, looking at the sea. For a moment, she thought of Paris, the luxurious dinners, the designer clothes, the unlimited bank account. Then she looked at Miguel, at the small town she now called home, and smiled. "Yes," she replied, tears in her eyes. "For the first time in a long time, I am truly happy." Miguel smiled back, taking her hand. At that moment, with her feet in the sand and the sun setting on the horizon, Sophie knew she had found something that all the money in the world couldn't buy: authenticity and true connections. Autumn arrived in Nerja, bringing with it cooler winds and shorter days. For Sophie, or rather Emma, the past 6 months had been a journey of self-discovery and growth. Her relationship with Miguel had blossomed from a close friendship into something deeper, something she had never experienced before. On a starry night, walking hand in hand along the beach after work at the restaurant, Emma felt the weight of the secret she carried. Looking at Miguel, with his gentle eyes and sincere smile, she made a decision: it was time to tell the truth. "Miguel," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about me, about who I really am." Miguel stopped, turning to face her with a worried expression. "What is it, Sophie? You know you can tell me anything." Emma took a deep breath, preparing to reveal everything: her real name, her family, the fortune she had left behind. But before she could utter the words, a scream echoed across the beach. "Help! Someone call an ambulance!" Instinctively, Miguel and Emma ran toward the sound. On the sand, they found Elena bent over an immobile figure: Juan, the fisherman. He was pale, struggling to breathe. "He just collapsed," Elena explained, panicking. "We were talking, and suddenly..." The next few minutes were a blur of action. Miguel called the ambulance while Emma, remembering the first aid courses she had taken in Paris, tried to help Juan. When the paramedics arrived, rushing Juan to the hospital, Emma's revelation was forgotten. In the days that followed, the small community of friends gathered around Juan and his family. The diagnosis wasn't good: he would need an expensive surgery and a long recovery period. For a fisherman's family, it was a devastating blow. Emma found herself torn. She had the means to help, to cover all of Juan's medical expenses and ensure his family was well. But doing so would mean exposing her secret, revealing she wasn't who everyone thought she was. While wrestling with this dilemma, another unexpected event shook her new life. One morning, arriving at El Rincón del Sol, she found Javier, the owner, sitting at a table with a somber expression. "Sophie, Miguel, please sit down," he said, his voice weary. "I have bad news." The restaurant was facing financial difficulties. The summer season hadn't been as profitable as expected, and now, with autumn's arrival and the decrease in tourism, Javier didn't know if he could keep the business open. "I'll do my best not to lay anyone off," he promised, "but things will be tight in the coming months." Emma felt the world she had so carefully built begin to crumble. One in the hospital, the restaurant in peril, and her secret weighing heavier on her conscience. That night, alone in her small apartment, Emma cried. For the first time since leaving Paris, she allowed herself to feel the magnitude of her decision. She could have solved all these problems with a phone call, with access to her bank account. But doing so would mean losing everything she had achieved, the life she had built, the person she had become. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Miguel. "Sophie," he said, entering and sitting beside her. "I know something's bothering you. You were about to tell me something on the beach before all this happened." Emma looked at him, her heart pounding. This was the moment. She could tell him everything, reveal who she really was. Or she could keep the secret, continue being Sophie, the French waitress everyone knew and loved. "Miguel, she began, but once again was interrupted. Miguel's phone rang. He answered, his expression shifting from worry to shock. "What? Now?" Yes, we're on our way." He hung up, turning to Emma with urgency in his eyes. "It's Juan. There were complications. We need to go to the hospital now." And so, once again, Emma's truth hung in the air as she and Miguel rushed to face yet another crisis. The following weeks were a whirlwind of events for Emma. El Rincón del Sol, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed like a shadow of its former self. Javier struggled daily to keep the doors open, juggling bills and reducing operating hours. One afternoon, while cleaning empty tables, Emma overheard a conversation between Javier and his wife, Carmen. "We can't continue like this, Javier," Carmen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Maybe it's time to accept that we need to close." Javier sighed heavily. "This restaurant is our dream, Carmen. The legacy we wanted to leave for our children. I can't give up so easily." Emma felt a lump in her throat. The restaurant was not just a job for her, it was the heart of her new life, the place where she made friends, where she felt part of something bigger. Meanwhile, Juan's situation at the hospital had stabilized, but the family faced a mountain of medical deaths. The community rallied to help, organizing charity events and raising funds, but it was far from enough. It was amidst this uncertain backdrop that the unthinkable happened. One rainy night, Emma received a call that froze her blood. "Sophie. It's Elena. Miguel had a motorcycle accident. He's in the hospital." Emma's world crumbled. Rushing through the slippery streets of Nerja, she arrived at the hospital, breathless and soaked. Miguel was in the emergency room, unconscious and with multiple injuries. The doctor, with a grave expression, explained the situation: "He needs urgent surgery. There are internal damages that need to be treated immediately." "We'll do the surgery, of course," Emma said without hesitation. The doctor exchanged a look with Elena. "Miss, I understand your concern, but this is a complex and expensive surgery. Miguel's insurance doesn't cover it entirely." Reality hit Emma like a punch. She had the means to save Miguel, to save the restaurant, to help Juan and his family. But doing so would mean exposing her secret, revealing she wasn't who everyone thought she was. That night, alone in her small apartment, Emma faced the greatest dilemma of her life. On one hand, the secret she had kept for months, the new identity she had built, the fear of losing the genuine connections she had formed. On the other, the lives of the people she loved, people who welcomed her without questions, who treated her with genuine kindness. Sitting at the kitchen table, Emma picked up her phone. With trembling fingers, she dialed a number she hadn't used in months. "Hello? Dad?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. On the other end of the line, there was a moment of shocked silence, followed by her father's emotional voice. "Emma? Mon Dieu, is that really you? We were so worried." Tears began to flow down Emma's face. "Dad, I need your help. Not for me, but for people who have become very important to me." As she explained the situation, omitting details about her new life, Emma felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Her father, after the initial shock, agreed to help, transferring the necessary funds to an account Emma could access. With the money on the way, Emma knew she could resolve the financial problems plaguing her friends. But now, she faced an even more difficult question: how to explain this sudden change of fortune without revealing her true identity. Looking out the window, at the lights of the small town she had come to love, Emma made a decision. She would help Miguel, save the restaurant, and assist Juan. But to do so, she would have to tell the truth, no matter the consequences. With a heavy heart but determined, Emma prepared to face the next day, knowing that nothing would be the same once the truth came out. The morning after her decision to reveal the truth, Emma awoke to a firm knock on her door. Still groggy, she opened it to find two men in suits with serious expressions. "Miss Sophie Lambert?" asked the taller one, showing a badge. "We're from the Spanish police. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Emma's heart raced. She invited them in, trying to stay calm as her mind raced with possibilities. Had her call to her father the night before triggered this? "Miss Lambert," began the shorter policeman, consulting a notepad, "or should I say, Miss Robert?" Emma felt the blood freeze in her veins. They knew. "We've received information that you might be involved in suspicious activities," the policeman continued. "Your sudden disappearance from France, the change of identity. This raises many questions. I can explain, Emma stammered, but she was interrupted. Miss, we're investigating possible connections to money laundering and tax evasion. Your family in France hired private detectives who traced you here, and that caught our attention. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Emma. She had fled to escape the falsehood of her previous life, only to be suspected of crimes she never committed. Please, gentlemen, she said, gathering courage, this is a misunderstanding. I came to Spain to start over, to find a more authentic life. The policemen exchanged skeptical looks. Miss Robert, we'll need you to accompany us to the station for further clarification. At that moment, another knock sounded at the door. It was Miguel, pale and with his arm in a cast, accompanied by Elena and Javier. Sophie, what's going on? Miguel asked, looking confused at the policeman. Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. This was not how she had planned to reveal the truth, but now she had no choice. Miguel, all of you. I'm sorry. My real name is Emma Robert. I came from France, from a wealthy family, but... She then told everything, her voice trembling but firm. She spoke about the empty life in Paris, the decision to flee, the desire to find real connections. As she spoke, she saw her friends' faces shift from confusion to shock, and then, surprisingly, to understanding. But why didn't you tell us before? Elena asked softly. I was afraid, Emma admitted. Afraid of losing all this, of losing you. For the first time in my life, I felt part of something real, something I built on my own. The policemen listened attentively, their expressions gradually softening. Miss Robert, said the taller policeman after a moment of silence, we understand your situation, but we still need to verify some information. For now, you're not under arrest, but we ask that you remain in the city until we resolve this. Emma nodded, grateful not to be taken away immediately. After the police left, she faced her friends' gazes, fearing what she would find. To her surprise, she saw no anger or betrayal, only concern and a hint of curiosity. So, Javier began, scratching his head, you're a French millionaire who ran away to work as a waitress in a Spanish restaurant? Emma couldn't help but let out a nervous laugh. Basically, yes. Miguel approached her, taking her hand. Sophie. Emma. It doesn't matter what your name is. You're the same person we fell in love with. The person who worked hard, who cared for us, who became part of our family. Miguel's words opened the floodgates, and Emma began to cry, a mix of relief and gratitude flooding her being. But now, Elena intervened with a cheeky smile, you'll have to tell us all the stories of French high society. As her friends surrounded her with hugs and words of support, Emma realized that despite the challenges she would still face with the police investigation, she had finally found her true home. A home built not with luxury and privilege but with friendship, understanding, and unconditional love. The afternoon sun bathed El Rincón del Sol when two police cars stopped in front of the restaurant. Emma, who was serving a table, felt her heart stop for a moment. She knew this day would come, but she didn't expect it to be so soon. The policemen entered, their gazes fixed on her. Miss Emma Robert, announced the chief inspector, his voice echoing in the now silent restaurant. You're under arrest for interrogation. The sound of breaking dishes made everyone turn. Miguel had dropped a tray, his face a mask of shock and confusion. Emma? What is he talking about, Sophie? Emma closed her eyes for a moment, gathering courage. When she opened them, she saw all the faces turned towards her, curious customers, confused colleagues, and her closest friends, Miguel, Javier, Elena, all waiting for an explanation. I'm sorry, she began, her voice trembling but determined. My real name is Emma Robert. I came from France, from a wealthy and influential family. But I ran away from that life, looking for something real, something true. A murmur ran through the restaurant. Emma continued, the words pouring out like a dam finally breaking. Everything I've lived here, all the friendships, all the hard work, it was real. I just wanted a chance to be myself, without the weight of the Robert name. The inspector stepped forward. Miss Robert, there are suspicions of illegal activities related to your escape and change of identity. We need to take you in for clarification. At that moment, Miguel stood between Emma and the policeman. Wait a minute. What kind of suspicions? Sophie. I mean, Emma, has been nothing but honest and hardworking since she got here. Javier joined him. That's right. She's one of the best employees I've ever had. If there's any misunderstanding, surely we can clear it up right here. The inspector hesitated, clearly not expecting this reaction. Well, the main concerns are about possible tax evasion and the use of a false identity. Emma stepped forward. I can explain everything. There was no tax evasion, I simply stopped using my fortune. As for the identity, I admit I used a false name, but it was out of fear, not malice. Elena, who had been silent until then, spoke up. Inspector, I've known Sophie for months. She helped organize charity events, worked extra hours without complaint, and became a vital part of our community. Doesn't that count for something? The restaurant, once silent, now buzzed with voices of support. Regular customers, other employees, even old fisherman Juan, who had just entered, all spoke in Emma's defense. The inspector, visibly uncomfortable with the situation, consulted with his colleagues for a moment. Finally, he turned to Emma. Miss Robert, given the circumstances, we won't detain you now. But you'll need to appear at the station tomorrow with all relevant documentation. And you're forbidden from leaving the city until we resolve this situation. Emma nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. When the policeman left, she found herself surrounded by her friends and co-workers. Miguel was the first to speak. Why didn't you tell us before? With tears in her eyes, Emma replied, I was afraid. Afraid of losing all this, of losing you. For the first time in my life, I felt part of something real, something I built myself. Javier placed a hand on her shoulder. Look, I won't pretend I'm not shocked. But you've proven your worth here, not with a name or money, but with your work and your heart. Tomorrow, Elena said firmly, we'll all go with you to the station. We'll make it clear that you belong here, in Nerja, with us. Emma looked around at the faces that had become her family. There was confusion, yes, maybe even a little hurt. But above all, there was support and love. Thank you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I promise that from now on, there will only be truth between us. As the sun set over Nerja, Emma knew the coming days would be challenging. There would be explanations to give, documents to present, and possibly a legal battle to face. But for the first time since fleeing Paris, she didn't feel alone. With her true friends by her side, Emma was ready to fight for her place in this little piece of paradise she now called home.